Thank you so much. I'm really, really pleased to be here, and I didn't see where Maria went, but thank you for the very kind introduction and the many, many conversations that have nourished much of my thinking about this topic on the history of women in psychedelics, but also the history of psychedelics more broadly. I've been studying the history of psychedelics for about 25 years now. I started off as a PhD student. Even before I was a PhD student, I was nervously and naively doing interviews with people like Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer in the late 1990s. And I embarrassingly met Timothy Leary once when I was a teenager, and I did not know who he was. This will just show you how old I was, that I didn't have a handheld device where I could quickly Google him, and I didn't run to the card catalog to find out who this man was, who appeared at my university, where I happened to be the student manager at the theater where he was speaking that day. But technically, I did meet him, so I feel honored for that. So when I started my PhD in 2001, I was interested in the sort of Western biomedical history of psychedelics. I focused a lot on LSD and mescaline and sort of how these concepts, how these ideas came to be. But even in the doing of that history, there were women in the backgrounds, and there were women there, and they didn't make it into my dissertation, and this bugged me. And so I've spent some time doing sort of atoning for my sins and trying to now rethink what that history means. What does it mean to leave these women out and leave those stories out? And I'll give you a few examples as we go through. But one of the things I wanted to play with here, and Maria and I had been talking about this, I said, well, what do you want me to talk about? And she's like, sorry? Sorry. Thank you. And if I speed up when I get nervous, you just wave at me and I will slow down again. All right. One of the things I was thinking about is the way that we have father figures within history, the father of chemistry, the father of psychopharmacology, and where are the mother figures, and what does it mean to be a mother? So I'm choosing a few examples here, some who are themselves biological mothers, and others who are mothers of an idea. So you may recognize some of the people on the screen, you may not. On your left, my right, Jane Osmond is first kissing her son as he goes off to kindergarten. This is Humphrey Osmond's wife and their youngest son. And then later, she's holding her granddaughter, Chelsea Osmond, as she's reading her stories there in the color picture. In the middle, Mountain Girl, who's somewhere here or just outside, with sunshine. And we have Kat Harrison here with her granddaughter. Just as a way to anchor us. So I wanted to think about what does it mean then if we were to rewrite a history from the perspective of sort of the mothers of some of these stories, the mothers of some of these ideas. And again, in the most expansive sense of the concept of mothers. And I like this image provided by Stacey Schaefer of Ananda Kanada's holding peyote from the peyote gardens, who's a protector and preserver of peyote. And I see that as a kind of nurturing spirit. And I also think about what does it mean if we retell this history or rethink this history from the perspective of, nurturing movements and nurturing ideas. What does that do for the future, for our daughters? I learn a lot from my children. I feel even more technologically inept than I did just on my own. Children are really good at reminding you how unhip you are. This is my young daughter. I don't know how old she was here, maybe 3 years old. I broke her out of daycare that day, and she said, Mom, no, don't take my picture, take this picture. She insisted on holding up these placards of these first wave feminists who were being celebrated in this display. I was like, what a meta kid, She's so weird, but it's a lovely image that I now use without her permission, just to get her back. It's a mother's prerogative, right? Because I think about, what does it reinvesting, or what is investing in thinking about mothers, again, with the quotation marks and all the caveats, mothers of ideas, mothers of movements, do to our daughters? So I've spent a bunch of time writing about psychedelics. I've done a graphic novel on psychedelics. I'm working on a global history of psychedelics. I've written about Humphrey Osmond's coining of the term psychedelics, and all of this kind of stuff on psychedelics that I think Maria and I have talked about some of these things, and some of you I've sat in your living rooms and shared tea with you and talked about your ideas on psychedelics. But what you might not know is my other work on motherhood. So here I just give a few examples of different people and ideas that I'm using as inspiration for what it means to be a mother. So, and you can choose who you like on here. There's me with my face painted by my children. That sometimes being embarrassed by your children is what it means to be a mother. But there are also mothers on display here who really have nurtured our ideas, our movement, and I know many of you here know some of the people on the screen. Mothers who have boldly taken chances, taken risks, and continued to nurture our own development and saved space for us so that we too can grow and blossom in that space. You may know many of these people. You may not know Rita Hooney-Kuhn, who's in the middle, and her picture's on the top. And I wanted to draw your attention if you don't know her. She's an indigenous artist in Peru, and her image there is of a mother earth goddess. And we've recently been in conversation. We're going to host some of her work in an upcoming book. And so I wanted to bring that here as well in the spirit of the conversations we've had about what she sees as the future of psychedelics, aligning ideas of motherhood with saving the planet, environmentalism, and thinking about these in really expansive terms. Maria Sabina is honored here in an image by Rene Alvarado. He's an indigenous artist from Oaxaca area who uses clay from the area where Maria Sabina grew up and turns it into pigment that he uses in his images. Again, really sort of bringing to life these ideas of honoring this woman's spirit, as he describes, the teaching spirits, and also the actual land and clay from where she lived. And we have some philosophers and psychologists and archivists on there, many of whom you will know. If not, you will by the end of this presentation. So why mothers? In my other work, so I did a bunch of work on psychedelics, and then I was told by my supervisor, you're never gonna get a job if all you do is drug history. People are gonna get the wrong impression of you. You gotta do real history. So I was like, fine. I will study women who were sterilized without their consent. See how that'll go. So for a little while, I did some work on the history of eugenics, mostly based in Canada. And then I did another book teaming up with my colleague who's an expert in Indigenous health, and we wrote about how women exercised choices when it came to birth control, abortion, and reproductive rights in the 1970s. And we recognized that there were still remnants of eugenics that affected, of course, marginalized women, women of color, and in particular, in our book at least, Indigenous women, who were not able to exercise choice even though the language was there and the laws were there. So I spent some time looking into these sterilization laws, and this really has made an impression on me about how politically important it is to recognize mothers. And I'm gonna just seize on that, and you'll have to put up with me for a few minutes. So in Canada, there were two provinces. I'm giving you a quick CanCon lesson here. There were two provinces that legally introduced sexual sterilization laws, British Columbia and Alberta. Every province and territory in Canada, as far as we can tell, engaged in some form of sexual sterilization, as did most states, as did many, many, if not most countries around the world. But legally and formally, that is, you can sue them, two provinces did. Alberta, where I was living at the time that I did this work, had the longest and most aggressive program. It was introduced in 1928. It ended in 1972. Over the course of that time, about 4,000 men and women were sterilized. Alberta has the distinguishing feature of removing the need for informed consent from their policies. It's really horrible. And so what we did over the course of about 10 years is we worked with men and women. It was 55% women sterilized, 45% men. We worked with men and women who had been sterilized without their knowledge or consent. And we tried to write a history from their perspective. And so I'm gonna just tell you a couple of things about these women and hopefully impress upon you why I think the politics of this are important. Doreen Bayfus, who you can read a little bit more about on this website if you're interested, died in 1991, so long before I started this research. I never had the chance to meet her. But I went to the archives and asked about, what do you have on this horrendous policy that I thought everybody knew about? And they said, we don't have anything. And there are no records. All the patient files were restricted. No one was allowed to look at them. But they had this box of records from some woman who'd been at a hospital. I was like, let me see them. It was her diaries of living in the hospital, and then her diaries changed as she was forcibly left the hospital, like hundreds of thousands of people throughout the Western world, as psychiatric hospitals closed. She moved into the community and tried to make her way, and it was there that she realized she had been sterilized. And for Doreen, she decided to turn this around a little bit. This is someone with almost no education. There was no expectation of education. She could read and she could write a little bit, but it was very limited. And she decided to start a sex education program in her community, particularly for men and women who had been living in institutions. And she got rewarded by her local municipality, who held her up as a woman of gold medal status for her gold medal citizenship. Another woman, and I'll just do these ones briefly, is Leilani Muir. Leilani Muir was sterilized at the age of 16. She'd been dropped off at the mental hospital for children, which was then called the Provincial Training School for Feeble-Minded Children. Her mother said she was delinquent, she was eating too much, she was a troublesome kid at school. Turns out she was hungry and stealing other kids' lunches. So she was sent to an institution where her parents never returned to pick her up. She lived there for the next 8 years. She was sterilized, again, without her knowledge or consent, something that she didn't learn about until she was married, trying to have children. Leilani Muir in 1995 was the first woman in Canada, the only woman in Canada, to successfully sue the government for the wrongful sterilization. That was the first time she ever saw her patient files. We worked together with her. There's a documentary about her now, and we've got some of her stuff featured on our website, where we worked with Leilani to tell her story in her words. What did it mean to her to have these rights taken away from her? She's rather disgruntled there. She said a lot of things. So the Premier of Alberta, where this took place at the time, decided he would invoke the notwithstanding clause. And I'm looking at the one Canadian I know here. Does anyone else know what that means? It means that, we're not constitutionally, these are my words, not his. They're not constitutionally responsible for things that happened in the past. They didn't feel that the taxpayers of today were responsible for the wrongdoings of the past, nor should be penalized for them. The notwithstanding clause did not hold up in court, but Leilani got $80,000. And there was a class action suit to follow, and they ranged from about $50,000 to nothing. And in order to get that money, they had to agree to never speak about this again. And this is partly why historians got together and said, we can. And just to put a somber tone on this, already somber, the notwithstanding clause has only been invoked 7 times in Canada. Its 8th time just happened in my province last week. I'm in California, I can say what I want, right? From my who is using it because he doesn't want schools to have to acknowledge pronoun policies. This is the kind of stuff that the notwithstanding clause is being used for these days. All of these are against human rights. Many of the times these notwithstanding clauses have been invoked has been against human rights, not to maintain the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, which was put in place in the first place. So as historians, we decided that this was bullshit, to put it mildly. We were outraged, and we were outraged as we collected the stories and worked with these women and men. We worked together for 7 years, to a point where people felt comfortable sharing their story. This takes a long time. And so students worked with survivors. They called themselves survivors of the eugenics program. And we wanted to push these stories out into the light and make it clear that there were all these different wrongdoings and that the politics of parenthood are complicated. They are not to be taken easily. And it was in one of these meetings, we're all feeling good about ourselves, and we were celebrating International Women's Day. And my daughter, the same one who was standing there with a placard. I told you she's annoying. She's lovely, but she cried her face off. We got off the plane in Edmonton, and we were driving, and if you know, it's an hour-long ride from the airport to the university, and she screamed her head off. I thought my poor graduate student was going to jump out the car, she was going to leave us, and we would go into the building, and she's just screaming, and I'm like, I can't give a presentation. She wouldn't nurse, she wouldn't do anything. She was just screaming her face off. And Leilani says, let me hold her. And you can't even see the tear-stained face on that kid. I was tear-stained. Leilani had her laughing and chuckling, and she said, can I hold her while I give the presentation? And here I was, here we are talking about Leilani having had this right taken away from her. She says, well, what did you expect? We had no education. I lived by babysitting. And I started looking for images. It turns out that these women, after they had been sterilized, could not work in jobs other than childcare. As a horrible irony, and something that you can't find in the archives. These aren't stories that are written down or codified, and it took those kind of moments to bring this out. This is the last thing on eugenics. I promise I'm going to talk about psychedelics. Right now in Canada, again, there's a class action suit forming for the Indigenous women, that is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women who have been sterilized, again, wrongfully, or had their children removed from them as recently as last year. So this story continues, and part of what we're doing in this other work is to work with communities to make sure that these stories and these histories are known so that they can't be erased, they can't be made invisible, and we can't stand to forget or rest on our assumptions that these things happened in the way back. They're still happening. And I use this as a way to launch into the second part of my presentation, which is, why does it matter that we think about mothers, motherhood, women, gender? Why does it matter that we think about this? It's not just adding some new faces to the mix, but I think there are some deep political lessons in how we think about the invisibilization of women, to borrow Zoe's phrase, in this context. So I'm going to use my remaining time to talk about women and psychedelics then, with the specter. Sorry, slow down again? Okay, thank you. With the specter of the sort of politics of motherhood hovering in your minds, I hope, as we think through this. This is an image, I've seen it reproduced in a few different places, including on a paperback version, but I think it was originally published in the Oracle. I think Maria's nodding, so I'm going to go with yes. Women and psychedelics. Excuse me. So we know that there were women behind the scenes in a number of those sort of brave, bold, iconic, even these sort of epic moments of discovery within the history of psychedelics. And you may know many of them. I thought I'd bring a few out that may be less known. Has everyone heard of Jean-Paul Sartre's famous mescaline trip? He had a terrible time. He thought a crustacean was following him around. He thought mescaline was awful after this. But as a self-respecting French philosopher, he really needed to try the stuff. But it's probably thanks to Simone de Beauvoir, a feminist philosopher in her own right. It's thanks to her holding him through that experience and recording his notes and talking him through it and encouraging him to get through it that we even have access to that information. Now, she's no slouch when it comes to feminism. I mean, she has written lots of feminist texts that we probably admire and adore, but I wanted to sort of bring her here together with you, thinking about her and the necessary other, as Sartre called her, his necessary other. We've already heard about Susie Ramstein, and I won't say too much more, except I'm super excited we have the same photo of this woman inoculating rye, which you all heard about this morning. But we know that there are other women then, again, behind these moments of discovery, and I will give you a nod as I move on, Susie. That bicycle trip from Hoffman, of course, public transit was Susie's preferred mode of transportation when she first took LSD. And so again, I just acknowledge Maria and Susie here for bringing out these stories in the first place. Humphrey Osmond, you may know, drove from Saskatchewan to Los Angeles when he brought Aldous Huxley his first dose of mescaline in 1953. He did so with some trepidation. He was concerned about the effects that this might have on this already quite celebrated author, but he bravely walked up that driveway. Turns out he was invited there by Maria Huxley. And Maria and Jane stayed in touch for the next decade as they continued to talk through what this meant, this meeting of these two minds of men they felt talked funny, said Maria, who was not herself British. But they were from the same county, and they kind of had an understanding of one another, such that Huxley described Osmond as both his grandson and his grandfather, and what it meant to him in that kind of friendly relationship. They wrote letters frequently. They visited infrequently, but they wrote letters quite often. And in that, they're peppered with stories about how the wives are also talking with each other and passing little notes in the margins as they continue to communicate through these two men. And of course, I don't have a picture of Jane on this. She was on the front page, but after Maria died, and Aldous Huxley had nursed her through her final stages of cancer, he too succumbed to larynx cancer in his final days in 1963. And he asked his then wife, Laura Huxley, if she could give him, well, if you can read his writing, good on you. I'm told it says, LSD, try it, it means intramuscularly, we now understand, 100 micrograms. Laura administered LSD to Aldous Huxley on his deathbed. And he had written earlier about how he watched his first wife, Maria, succumb to death in a way that helped remind him of their experiences in ceremony with the Navajo First Nation. He talked about the way that it helped to release them from the mortal bonds of life, and he wanted that for himself at the end, and Laura obliged. And of course, this goes down perhaps in history as one of the recorded LSD deaths. I don't think it's actually the first, but we'll claim it there. They do. And this history is peppered with these examples of women who function as scribes, as I suggest that Simone de Beauvoir was in that instance, or as conduits, or adding meaning, nurturing different experiences, nurturing different ways of remembering experiences. And it came out a little bit in the interviews that I did in the early 2000s as, these important men, and I don't mean to they are important. I don't mean to diminish that. But they were like, what was I doing? What street was that? And it was always the wife, just off camera, who didn't want to be recorded and didn't want to be in front of the camera saying, honey, it was this. Even the process of remembering required this kind of interplay, this back and forth. And we see that with this famous story of the Wassons going to Oaxaca to meet Maria Sabina. And we know that Gordon Wasson was there a week earlier. We know that he first met Maria Sabina. But his mycologist wife with a PhD in mushroom studies and her pediatric degree as well, her incredible research ethic was certainly part of the story that led them there in the first place. And had she not died in 1958, a year after Life magazine published Seeking the Magic Mushroom, we might know more about Valentina Pavlovna Wasson, but we don't. I recently ordered their 2-volume, beautifully bound history of mushrooms in Russia, which also covers a whole section on Mesoamerica, and her work is all over it. There are very few copies left. They're rare copies now. You can get them in a few libraries in the world, but her work is all through it. It's like Zoe suggested, she wasn't invisible, but it's history and historians who have sometimes kind of done a shorthand or cut people out. Few other examples. Some of you may know this book, the Therapeutic Handbook for the Handbook for the Therapeutic Use of D-lysergic acid, Diethylmide 25. Duncan Blewett and Nick Chuelos are the named authors on here, and if you start digging through it, you'll start to see some of the other influences on this book as well. It was published is a strong word to say for this pamphlet. It was assembled and printed in 1959. Maps has now scanned it. You can take a look for yourself. And June Blewett, who became Duncan Blewett's wife, was a graduate student who was working on collecting the testimonies of students at the University of Regina as they assembled this guide. Embedded in the book are also traces of influences from the Native American church. Duncan Blewett sat in ceremony with the Native American church in North Battleford in Saskatchewan, and they talk about group practices being best informed by these traditions. They talk specifically about the Native American church in this context. Now, I don't think it would hold up to today's standards of recognition and appreciation, but I do want to acknowledge that there were diverse interests here that have kind of been written out. Amy and Kyo Izumi are a fascinating couple in this context. Kyo or Joe, was born in Vancouver, and after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Canadians, like Americans, interned people who looked Japanese, I will say, because truly it did not matter how closely they had lived in or when they lived in Japan. Kyo's family sent him to Saskatchewan at that time. They said, get out of here. He was a 20-something-year-old at the time, and Saskatchewan did a quick cost-benefit analysis. I'm not saying we are in any way enlightened, as propos my WVC premier, who was, anyway, but they did a cost-benefit analysis and said there are 300 people we can identify as Japanese. Let's just put them in a hotel and watch them instead of interning them totally. So it was like internment light, right? Kyo met his wife, Amy, whose father ran a gas station, and due to the need for gas during that time, they allowed that family business to keep running. And he later went off to architect school and became a decorated architect. In 1957, he was invited by Humphrey Osmond to come to Weyburn, the mental hospital, this large Gothic mental hospital. And Osmond said, we're trying this LSD and mescaline. We think that it has insights into how psychotic patients might experience their environments. You're an architect. You've got a whole other vocabulary for understanding design and environment. Why don't you try this and think about redesigning hospitals? And he did. In fact, Amy and Joe became godparents to the Osmond children. And it's through working with their children, the Izumis and the Osmond Blackburns, that I have these photographs that, again, don't make their way into any archives. But by talking to the children about their parents, we're starting to piece together these other elements of this history, where these families built kinship ties, worked together, and started to challenge some of the different ideas about hospitalization in this case. I don't have a picture of Ruth Hubbard, and like Margot Kuttner, if anybody has a picture of her, that would be great. I have been in touch with her granddaughter, who insists that Ruth never took LSD, which is just not right. I have hundreds of pages of documents that say she did in her handwriting, but I don't have a photograph of her. But some of you may have heard of Al Hubbard. Michael Pollan calls him the Johnny Appleseed of LSD. He was a registered, apparently legal distributor of LSD and would walk around with a briefcase of LSD, a carbogen tank, and a revolver, a hip pistol. He was a double agent during the 1930s in Oregon, Washington, out of Seattle. There's a great book called Seattle Mystic. I think it's there on the screen. That talks about his rum running and his sort of double agent status. But he also became very fascinated with LSD. And as the self-proclaimed sole proprietor and distributor for Sandoz, which I don't think is true, he also claimed to have a doctor, like he put it in quotation marks. He signed his letters, Dr. Hubbard, in quotation marks. And people like Abe Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond were like, just because you bought one, maybe you should keep that on the down low. But this was a way that he could cross borders with this large amount of LSD. He's sort of credited, and if you read Michael Pollan's book, he's credited for changing the set and setting and really sort of amplifying certain features of it, including the music. But what I find by going through the patient records and the case files associated with Hollywood Hospital, which was in New Westminster, British Columbia, Hubbard wasn't even in the room when Rita was the one dealing with the music. Sorry, Ruth. There's a number of times when a Hubbard is there, but it's clear that the patient has asked the men to leave the room. So there's only one Hubbard left in the room. And Ruth comes out of this experience as a music therapist, but she's not even named earlier on. But I have really strong instincts about this, that she was actually the one changing the music. She was the one making the musical selections, and she was the one holding the hands of the patients when they requested it. She was the only she in the room over the course of several different experiments, and she doesn't have a name. But, as Zoe's already told us, this history keeps getting dominated by these guys. And I like some of these guys. They're not all bad guys. But, you know, who's telling the history? And whose history are they? So, I got dared a few years ago, like, okay, there's all these guys doing this history, but there have to be some women. So, like, let's do a dare. Let's see if we can post something about women once a week, and we'll just see how long it goes. So we thought we'd get like maybe 10 posts and just like, you know, be those brave women and put it out there. So 75 posts later, I got tired. I was like, I need a break. But we started really trying to drill down into this idea that, you know, not only are there women who have been erased or removed or never part of the story, but women's contributions have a place in this history that is distinctive from that kind of pioneering bravado that we see on display in some other cases. And I don't know how long I've got now. Okay, I still have a bit of time. So as part of this, what I thought was the tail end of COVID, which I don't even know if it's over yet, but I got a sabbatical, so I decided to try to follow Osmond's lead. But instead of bringing mescaline to Maria, I decided to drive through blue states during, you know, like I said, it was sort of, the borders were open, but it was still sort of pandemic-y. And I only made it as far as San Francisco because you guys are all so fun here that I didn't need to go to Los Angeles. But I took this road trip and I interviewed people along the way, some of whom I already knew, I'd met before, and some of whom became known to me in the process of this tour. And I called it my Wise Woman Tour, so I put on my sabbatical report. I don't know what my dean thinks of it anyway, but I don't really care. And yeah, we spent 30 days on the road. My friend Pat Farrell, who is also an editor of many of these books, was with me. We did a bunch of things. So here's a bunch of borders. We met incredible, fabulous men and women who have helped to enrich this story by talking about a subject that has for a long time been taboo, that I think despite the best efforts of many historians and scholars trying to unearth some of these stories, they haven't been able to talk about them. I didn't know that Leilani was babysitting children until she was holding a child. The story never came up. It wasn't a question that I thought to ask. And it turns out that sitting with people and breaking bread and having tea and opening up these conversations changes the way I think about being a historian and what I think is important within this history. Here are just a few examples. I know some of you are in the room, so you can decide whether you want to identify yourselves. We did go to a library. I had to put proof of that here. I was at an archive as well. But a lot of it was sharing stories and laughing a lot and sometimes being mad and sometimes being upset. But you know, I don't think we found a single spot where we didn't find people who opened up and shared stories about the sort of domestic side, if you will, or the sides, the caring sides, the sides of psychedelics that we don't often find in the published literature. I won't go and tell you who all these people are, but I'm happy to talk about it later. Except that I will just point out a message from Michael Horowitz and Cindy Palmer, who I saw last week, and they said to send their love here, so I'm going to channel that for you all now. You can see them there on the bottom on your left. And it turns out that I had missed this too. As I got into different archives, and I should back this up. The other thing about meeting people in their place, whether that's in their homes or in the coffee shops nearby, is that people have been collecting histories of psychedelics that haven't made their way into libraries or archives, or even onto the internet in official ways. Erowid has done an incredible job, and there's still more. So this, I think it's actually 1987, I can't find a date on that, but I thought I would showcase this one little article that I found that is now in the New York Public Library. Michael Horowitz, of course, had it in his many, many boxes. But here In 1987, there's a whole article about women pioneers of psychedelics. And does anyone know who wrote this one? Do you know? You have a guess? We could do a lottery. Of course, Cindy Palmer. And here I just have a little quote from her here. She says, "From shamaness to Aquarian age poet, from experimentation by the artistic intelligentsia to expanding consciousness through psychedelicized therapy, all of these explorations occurred before the psychedelic revolution of the mid-1960s. They're free from both the explosive enthusiasm of the flower children and the conglomerate dread that arose as a result. They are pioneers of an approach to the inner landscapes that crosses time gracefully because of its basis in courage and receptivity." This is how she concludes her article about women in psychedelics. And I know she is a friend to many of you here, so I wanted to share that, revive that piece from her. Now, it's not a glossy thing. It's not on the internet that I can find. But there are these examples of both underground and buried bits of history that are there for revival. And I want to sort of come to a conclusion then in suggesting that it's not just adding women to the mix, which is also important, but there are perspectives that we learn from women who have been invisibilized, if I can borrow that word again, that are muted in the record. So does anyone know Eileen Garrett? She's holding Tomorrow magazine, the magazine she founded. She was at one time one of the most, I guess, famous or well-known psychic mediums or media. She worked very closely with people like Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley, but also a number of others, like that, what's his name, John F. Kennedy. He worked with him. She was considered a kind of legitimate medium. I don't know what an illegitimate one is. And her archives are hopefully going to be deposited soon. Her granddaughter is working on bringing that forward. And what was fascinating to me was I was trying to understand, how does Eileen Garrett fit into this? And she breathes a kind of language into the psychedelic conversation that comes from the space of the paranormal, that looks at different psychic entities and examines different ways that we might. So she works with Jung a lot as well. And she tries to think about and give terminology to unconscious or studies of the unconscious in a way that is outside of the frame of Western biomedicine. Those stories are at risk of being excluded from this larger network of psychedelic history if we push her to the side. We've already heard about Betty Eisner from Soy Debus, and I wanted to just talk about Kay Parley for a moment too. Maria, I know we've had, you're seeing all the inspiration here. We've sat at her kitchen table talking about Kay Parley. Kay Parley had her first mental breakdown, as she describes it, when she was a teenager in Toronto, Canada. It was a horrible experience. She felt very alone. She was far from her family, and she wasn't sure she would ever kind of find herself again. She was transferred to the Weyburn Psychiatric Hospital, which was where her family was, in Saskatchewan. And in the hospital, she met her grandfather for the first time and realized she had a family history of some kind of mental disorder that she wasn't even sure what it was at that time. She was ultimately diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and so she was discouraged from taking psychedelics, even though psychedelics were being tested at that same hospital at that time. But if any of you know anything about Kay, she doesn't really listen to orders. She decided she was recovered, and she went to nursing school. She became a psychiatric nurse. And part of the protocol for psychiatric nurse training in Saskatchewan in the 1950s was a strong encouragement to, under supervision, take LSD to empathize with your patients. Kay Parley said, "I don't know if I should do that, because my grandfather's still on the ward, and I know we are discouraged from taking psychedelics if we have a history of psychosis." But Francis Huxley was in town, and he was house sitting for the Osmonds, and he invited Kay over to the house. And so quietly, sort of off the grid, not on record, Kay Parley took LSD with Francis Huxley. And she describes the experience as sort of melting into the couch and worrying that she was going to lose herself in that moment. She wasn't sure she would ever come back. But come back she did. And she's written about it and many other stories. She is 100 this year. She was on the local radio recently talking about why we need to reinvest in psychedelics and why they are an important feature of our mental health treatment system. And this is her book, In the Mental, where she talks about this transformative experience, not necessarily in the way that we might think is LSD being transformative. What she describes about her LSD trip was that it helped her love herself because she knew the psychosis would end and she could enjoy it. Instead of fearing that organic experience she'd had as a teenager that she worried might come on at any time. She said under these conditions, she was able to love herself and see herself as whole, and that this part was part of her. It's a beautiful story. And finally, I'm really, really honored to share this little anecdote with you at the end. There was a famous Native American church ceremony in 1956 that took place in Canada, and it's famous because it is the ceremony that sort of clinched the decision to provide legal access to peyote, which does not grow in the wintered climate that I live in, but to allow Native American church members to get peyote either from northern Mexico or the peyote gardens in Texas and practice in a protected religious ceremony. That ceremony took place in 1956 in North Battleford, and as the newspapers claimed, 4 white scientists were invited to participate. And until very recently, I was convinced that this was a really nice event, and it's great that there's legal status, but it seemed very staged. These 4 white dudes show up, and all of these indigenous-looking people who are not named at all in the paper, sort of sit around. Many of them were wearing nice clothes. It seems very performative. And then the grandson of the woman sitting there invited me to come and sit ceremony with the Native American church that still meets on the anniversary of this event. And they honor the white scientists, although they just called them the doctors, those doctor dudes who came. And as the one nephew explained to me, he said that his uncle, who had carried the peyote from Montana to this ceremony, was trapped at the border, and they wouldn't let him go. His uncle didn't speak English very well, and he certainly didn't write. He didn't write English at all. And it was Duncan Blewett and Humphrey Osmond who came to the border and testified on his behalf and got him across the border, and then sat in ceremony and participated in this event, which they then wrote up. And I was like, uh-oh, how is this story going to go? How is 2023? What's the version of this story? And they said, without the help of those men coming to our ceremony, we would not have permission. We could not write this up. No one would have believed us. And they honor it every year. And it's made me rethink a little bit how I've been interpreting this history. I was incredibly honored to sit with the grandchildren and nephews, I should say, of, you can't tell here, but Kelly Daniels, who's smiling there between me and James, who've been up all night, and I don't even know if I was able to keep my eyes open. Kelly Daniels is he's the grandson of the water carrier, the woman water carrier that was seated there that I showed you. They have revived this. It was dormant for a little while, but the Native American church is actually flourishing right now in Sturgeon Lake First Nation, where they hosted the ceremony. But it was, of course, the aunties who took me under their wing. The aunties who also have relatives who are pictured in that black and white photo, but they were the ones who took me under their wing, and they're the ones who I continue to connect with and continue to think about and with their permission, I shared these pictures that were just from about a month ago. All right, so I promise I'm going to conclude. So I think, to me, the Renaissance is a really exciting opportunity, not just because, maybe we will change the regulatory status of some of our favorite substances, but I think it also is an invitation to think about creating different kinds of histories and imagining different voices, a different blend of voices, a different sort of tapestry of things that might go into nourishing this moment. And I've got a few examples here, whether it's artists like Nan Kuz, whose work in The Kingdom of Mescal is just a brilliant depiction of her relationship to mescaline, well, she talks about it as mescaline, as the peyote in her home community of Guatemala. Or Max Bueno, who maybe some of you know, who's an artist who was treated by a Dutch psychiatrist, Van Bastiens, when he was given permission to use LSD for patients specifically with a syndrome that you will help me pronounce. When those Germans came in and occupied and created trauma for Dutch people, it's one word, but that one. There's a specific syndrome that allowed. Survival syndrome, is that what you mean? Yeah. Survival guilt? No, it wasn't for their survivor guilt, but there was, anyway, Bastians was given special permission to continue using LSD into the 1980s. He's one of the few sort of legally recognized in that period of, yeah. Some of his patients produced art as well that is now starting to surface. As our conversation about psychedelics changes, some of this work is starting to surface as people, and especially children and grandchildren, are less embarrassed to show the relationship to psychedelics. And I had a little tribute here to Mark McLeod, and thanks to the art that I see, much of which is on display from him as well, who also is a treasure trove of information and history and artifacts and ephemera of a history that is really a kind of black market history, so one that, again, is not found in the archives. And that's just here. What if we did this around the world and thought about connecting to different traditions, languages, ideas, and different kinds of mothers of these ideas? These are maps based on things you can find on the internet. They are not accurate, in my opinion. I mean, they're pretty, but they help to show us where there are gaps in our knowledge. So I'm a different historian as a result of my Wise Women trip. I don't even know if I need to go to the archives anymore. I'm just kidding. I'll still go to the archives. But I'm going to visit also the archives in some of your basements and on your own library shelves. And I think talking to people is really important. Studying the forbidden is something that requires a creative approach, I think, and bringing light, shedding light on those invisible spaces. I don't know if you shed. Yeah. My metaphor's not going to work there. Drawing attention to things that have been purposefully pushed underground requires different creative techniques, I think. The ethics, yeah. So according to my university, if I find someone who has taken an illegal substance, I'm supposed to report that to the authorities. I studied women who were safely getting abortions by crossing borders, and I study people who take drugs. So I forgot to ask for an ethics permission form to talk to you, I guess. And I hope that by adding these things that I'll put in quotation marks, invisible, to this history, it helps to change the way we think about what's important in the future as well. What's important or what's at stake in the historical Renaissance, as well as what's at stake when we move forward with the Renaissance. What's at stake when Oregon changes the laws? How do we manage that? So my answers are collaboration. My answers aren't very robust, so I hope you're all sitting down for these ones, but working across linguistic lines, finding ways of building platforms together to help people have a voice, share their voice, feel safe in sharing that voice is important. And it comes in a variety of forms, whether it's, I put here Mujeres y Psicodélicos, the book we launched in Spanish, where we focused on bringing Latin American women's voices to the conversation. We wanted the South to speak to the North, and we wanted to sort of push that agenda a little bit. It is not comprehensive, there are lots of missing parts, but we wanted to kickstart this conversation. And I also include a Zoom call that was really pretty awesome for me. Kat Harrison and Michael Horowitz, this is an action shot of them trying to determine who wrote something, and I was just giggling and taking pictures of them. But this electronic age is opening up new possibilities for that kind of collaboration. Internationalizing, globalizing is a key part of that, I think. And then finally, I think we have to share the stage. I know this might be controversial, but hopefully not here. Sometimes we see the same people speaking on the stage over and over again, and they have important things to say. but we might have to share the stage and pay for the same stage for people who haven't had a chance to speak before. And I just show some of my students and some of the people who have transcribed many things and also who are just sort of part of this growing attempt to bring different voices to the fore. So thanks.
Milagro.